Hey there. Tonight we're going back to the dying days of the Old West to tell the story of a man who was more than just an outlaw. This is the story of Hosea Matthews, a con man who became a father, a thief who became a philosopher, and a man whose wisdom and compassion held together a family that was always on the edge of falling apart. If this story helps you rest, feel free to subscribe the channel, but only if it brings you some peace. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always comforting to know who else is out there settling in for the night. Hosea Matthews' story is one of wisdom earned through experience, of fatherhood found in unlikely places, of a man who tried to guide others toward better choices while knowing his own past was full of mistakes. His journey through the Red Dead Redemption series is both heartwarming and heartbreaking, showing a man who understood that the outlaw life was doomed but who stayed with his family anyway, trying to protect them and guide them for as long as he could. Understanding Hosea means understanding the gang he helped build, the young men he raised as sons, the woman he loved and lost, and the impossible task of trying to be the voice of reason in a world that rewarded violence and recklessness. This is the complete story of Hosea Matthews, outlaw, conman, father, friend, and the conscience of the Van der Linde gang. Hosea Matthews was born sometime in the 1840s, probably around 1844 or 1845, making him in his mid-50s during the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 in 1899. His early life is somewhat mysterious, as Hosea was always more interested in talking about others than about himself. But we know he grew up in the American frontier during a time of tremendous change and opportunity. Hosea came from a relatively educated background, unusual for someone who ended up as an outlaw. He could read and write well, was familiar with literature and philosophy, and had a way with words that suggested formal education, or at least extensive self-education. Hosea's path to outlawry wasn't driven by poverty or desperation like many criminals of his era. Instead, Hosea seems to have been drawn to the outlaw life by a combination of wanderlust, opportunism, and perhaps a certain romantic notion of living free from society's constraints. Hosea was a con man and a thief, someone who used his intelligence and his charm to separate people from their money. He wasn't violent by nature, preferring to talk his way out of situations rather than fight his way out. Hosea's crimes were about cleverness and deception rather than brutality, about outsmarting people rather than overpowering them. In his younger years, Hosea travelled extensively across the American frontier, running cons and scams, stealing what he could, and generally living the life of a wandering criminal. His skills as a con man were legendary and were based on deep understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Hosea understood what motivated people, what they feared and what they desired, how they made decisions and how they could be manipulated. This understanding came from decades of observation and practice, from running countless cons and learning what worked and what didn't. The cons Hosea ran were varied and creative, showing his adaptability and his understanding of human nature. He might pose as a wealthy investor looking to fund local businesses, gaining people's trust and their money before disappearing. His performance would be flawless, his accent and mannerisms perfectly matching his assumed identity, his knowledge of business and finance convincing enough to fool people who should know better. He might play a grieving widower selling family heirlooms, exploiting people's sympathy and their desire for bargains. He might set up elaborate schemes involving fake businesses or investment opportunities, creating entire fictional worlds to separate marks from their money. These cons required intelligence, patience, and acting ability. skills that Hosea developed and refined over years of practice. Hosea's preference for non-violent crime wasn't just moral squeamishness. It was pragmatic recognition that violence drew attention and created problems. Every person killed was a potential witness eliminated, but also a crime that law enforcement would investigate more seriously. Robberies that involved killing were more likely to result in wanted posters, bounty hunters, and sustained law enforcement pressure. Cons that relied on deception rather than violence were safer and more sustainable, allowing criminals to operate without drawing as much attention. But Hosea's life as a solo conman was also lonely and ultimately unsatisfying. Cons required constant movement, constant reinvention, constant vigilance against being caught or recognized. Hosea couldn't form lasting relationships or put down roots anywhere, couldn't trust anyone or let anyone get close to him. This isolation was the cost of the conman's life, and while Hosea was good at it and successful at it, he also recognized its limitations and its costs. Hosea's life changed fundamentally when he met Dutch van der Linde, probably sometime in the early to mid-1870s. The exact circumstances of their meeting aren't detailed in the games, but it's clear that the two men recognized something in each other, a partnership that would last for over 20 years. Dutch was younger than Hosea, probably in his early 20s when they met, charismatic and ambitious, but also somewhat naive and idealistic. Hosea was older and more experienced, pragmatic and cautious, but also drawn to Dutch's vision and energy. The partnership between Hosea and Dutch was complementary and powerful, but it was also marked by fundamental differences that would become more pronounced over time. Dutch provided the vision and the charisma, the ability to inspire people and make them believe in something larger than themselves. Hosea provided the pragmatism and the planning, the ability to think through consequences and avoid unnecessary risks. Dutch was the dreamer, Hosea was the realist. Dutch was the face of their operation, Hosea was the brains. Dutch was ambitious and idealistic, driven by ego and by a need to be seen as a great man leading a great cause. Hosea was pragmatic and realistic, more interested in survival and in taking care of the people he loved than in grand visions or legendary status. But their partnership was more than just professional. It was a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and affection. Dutch and Hosea genuinely liked each other, enjoyed each other's company, and trusted each other completely. They shared a vision of living free from society's rules, of creating their own way of life outside the constraints of civilization. The early years of their partnership, before they took in Arthur, and before the gang grew large, were probably the best years of both men's lives. They were young and successful, pulling off cons and robberies that brought in good money without too much risk. They were friends and equals, partners who respected each other, and who balanced each other's strengths and weaknesses. Even in these early years, Hosea's understanding of the changing West was deeper and more nuanced than Dutch's. Hosea had lived through decades of transformation, watching as the frontier was settled, as railroads connected distant territories, as law enforcement became more organized and effective. Hosea had seen towns grow from rough mining camps into proper cities, with schools and churches and police forces. He'd watched as the spaces where outlaws could operate freely shrank year by year, as telegraph lines made communication instant and made it harder for criminals to stay ahead of the law. This understanding of historical forces and social change set Hosea apart from Dutch and from most outlaws. Dutch saw the encroachment of civilization as something that could be fought or escaped, as a challenge to be overcome through cleverness and determination. Hosea understood that civilization's advance was inevitable, that the outlaw way of life was doomed not because outlaws weren't smart or tough enough, but because the world was changing in ways that made outlawry unsustainable. This difference in worldview would create ongoing tension between them, manageable when Dutch was willing to listen to Hosea's counsel, but destructive as Dutch became more resistant to advice. In the late 1870s, probably around 1877 or 1878, Dutch and Hosea took in their first son, a young teenager named Arthur Morgan. Arthur was an orphan, surviving on the streets through petty crime, alone and desperate. Dutch and Hosea didn't just recruit Arthur as another gang member, they genuinely took him in as a son, teaching him to read and write, training him in the skills he'd need to survive, giving him the family and purpose he desperately needed. This act of taking in Arthur transformed Dutch and Hosea's partnership into something more, the beginning of what would become the Van der Linde gang's family structure. Hosea took to fatherhood naturally, despite never having biological children of his own. He was patient and kind with Arthur, teaching him not just criminal skills but also how to think critically, how to read people and situations, how to survive through intelligence as well as strength. Hosea's views on education and its importance were progressive for his time and his circumstances. Hosea believed that education was a tool for survival and advancement, that understanding the world and how it worked was as important as physical strength or skill with weapons. Hosea taught Arthur to read and write, opening up worlds of knowledge and ideas that Arthur never would have accessed otherwise. He taught Arthur about human nature, about how to read people and situations, about how to survive through intelligence as well as strength. He taught Arthur about consequences, about thinking through actions and understanding their likely results. The education Hosea provided wasn't just practical, it was also cultural and moral. Hosea taught Arthur about literature and philosophy, about different ways of thinking about the world and about right and wrong. Hosea encouraged him to appreciate beauty and meaning, to see value in things beyond just survival and profit. This cultural education made Arthur more than just a thug or a criminal. It made him a thoughtful person, capable of moral reasoning and aesthetic appreciation. Hosea's own education and his love of literature were sources of joy and meaning in his life. Hosea could quote Shakespeare and discuss classic literature, could find parallels between their situations and stories from books. This literary knowledge gave Hosea perspective on their struggles, helped him see patterns and themes that others missed. It also gave Hosea a way to process and understand his own experiences, to find meaning in the chaos and violence of outlaw life. The relationship between Hosea and Arthur developed over years, growing from teacher-student to something more like father-son. Hosea was proud of Arthur, proud of his strength and his skill, but also proud of his capacity for kindness and his sense of right and wrong. Hosea could see that Arthur was better than the life they'd led, that Arthur had the potential to be something more than just an outlaw. Arthur loved both Dutch and Hosea as fathers, but his relationship with Hosea was perhaps deeper and more genuine, built on Hosea's consistent presence and his genuine care for Arthur's well-being. A few years after taking in Arthur, probably in the early 1880s, Dutch and Hosea took in another young man, John Marston. John was even younger than Arthur had been, probably around 12 years old, and even more damaged and difficult. John had been abandoned by his father and had survived through crime and prostitution, developing a hard shell and a distrustful nature. Taking in John was more challenging than taking in Arthur had been, as John was more resistant to authority and more prone to running away or causing trouble. But Hosea persisted, showing John the same patience and care he'd shown Arthur, gradually earning John's trust and helping him become part of the family. The relationship between Hosea and John was more complicated than Hosea's relationship with Arthur, partly because John was more difficult and partly because Arthur was already there, creating a dynamic where John sometimes felt like the less favoured son. John required more work and more patience, and while Hosea provided both, the relationship never quite reached the depth and ease of Hosea's relationship with Arthur. But Hosea's influence on John was still profound and lasting, teaching John to read and write, teaching him about responsibility and what it meant to be a father and a partner, about the obligations that came with having a family. During this period, the Van der Linde gang grew from just Dutch, Hosea, and their adopted sons into a larger organisation. They recruited other members, people who were drawn to Dutch's vision, or who needed the protection and community the gang offered. The gang pulled off increasingly ambitious robberies and cons, making money and building a reputation. The gang's best years, probably in the 1880s and early 1890s, were characterised by successful operations, relative stability, and genuine camaraderie among members. The gang's structure and dynamics were shaped significantly by Hosea's influence and his approach to leadership. Unlike many outlaw gangs that were held together purely by fear and profit, the Van der Linde gang had genuine bonds of affection and loyalty among its members. This was partly due to Dutch's charisma and his ability to inspire devotion, but it was also due to Hosea's consistent care and his efforts to create a genuine community. Hosea made sure that gang members felt valued and respected, that their contributions were recognised, that they had support when they needed it. Hosea's role in the gang was multifaceted and essential. He was a planner and strategist, scouting opportunities and designing operations. He was a mediator and counsellor, helping to resolve conflicts between gang members and providing guidance to those who needed it. He was a teacher and mentor, particularly to Arthur and John, but also to younger gang members who looked to him for wisdom. He was a father figure and a source of emotional support, someone gang members could talk to about their fears and their hopes. All of these roles were crucial to the gang's functioning and its cohesion. Hosea's relationship with the gang's women deserves particular attention, as it shows his respect for women and his recognition of their contributions. In an era and a context where women were often marginalised or exploited, Hosea treated the women in the gang as equals and valued members of the community. He respected Susan Grimshaw's authority in managing the camp and supported her decisions. He encouraged Mary Beth's literary aspirations and discussed books with her. He was protective of Tilly and Karen and the other women, making sure they were safe and that their needs were met. This respect for women set an example for the other men and contributed to the relatively egalitarian atmosphere of the camp. The stories Hosea told around the campfire were more than just entertainment. They were teaching tools and ways of passing on wisdom and values. Hosea would tell stories about his past adventures, about cons he'd run and people he'd met, about the changing West and what it meant to live as an outlaw. These stories contained lessons about human nature, about the consequences of choices, about what mattered, and what didn't. The younger gang members who listened to these stories were learning from Hosea's experiences, gaining wisdom that would help them navigate their own lives. Hosea's storytelling also served to maintain the gang's sense of identity and shared history, creating a narrative that bound gang members together and gave them a sense of continuity and purpose. Hosea's sense of humour was dry and often self-deprecating, a way of dealing with the hardships and absurdities of outlaw life. He could find humour in difficult situations, could make jokes that lightened the mood and help the gang cope with stress and danger. Hosea's humour was never cruel or at others' expense. It was gentle and inclusive, bringing people together rather than dividing them. This humour was part of what made Hosea so well liked within the gang, part of what made him such an effective leader and mentor. Hosea's relationship with Bessie, the woman who had become his wife, was one of the most important and defining relationships of his life. The exact timeline of when Hosea met Bessie isn't specified in the games, but it was probably sometime in the 1880s during the gang's earlier, more successful years. Bessie wasn't part of the outlaw life. She was a respectable woman, and her relationship with Hosea represented a connection to the legitimate world that Hosea had left behind. Bessie and Hosea married, and for a time Hosea tried to live a more settled life, balancing his outlaw activities with his marriage. Bessie's influence on Hosea was profound and positive. She brought out the best in him, encouraged his better instincts, and probably tried to convince him to leave the outlaw life entirely. Hosea loved Bessie deeply, and his time with her seems to have been the happiest period of his life. This respect for women was probably influenced by Hosea's relationship with Bessie, which had shown him that women were capable of intelligence, strength, and wisdom equal to any man's. Hosea's marriage to Bessie probably created tension with his outlaw life and his commitment to the gang. Bessie likely wanted Hosea to leave the criminal world, to settle down and live legitimately. Hosea probably tried to balance both worlds, maintaining his connection to the gang while also building a life with Bessie. But Hosea couldn't or wouldn't fully leave the gang, couldn't abandon Dutch and Arthur and the family they'd built together. This tension between his love for Bessie and his loyalty to the gang was probably a source of conflict and pain for Hosea. Bessie died sometime before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, probably in the mid to late 1890s. The exact circumstances of her death aren't detailed, but it's suggested that she died of illness, possibly pneumonia or another disease that was common and often fatal in that era. Bessie's death devastated Hosea, leaving him grieving and alone, having lost the woman he loved and the connection to a better life that she represented. After Bessie's death, Hosea threw himself back into the gang completely, no longer having any reason to maintain connections to the legitimate world or to consider leaving the outlaw life. Bessie's death probably changed Hosea, made him more resigned to dying as an outlaw, more focused on helping others have the chances at better lives that he'd lost. Hosea's grief over Bessie's death was private and enduring, something he carried with him but didn't often talk about. Instead, Hosea channeled his grief into caring for others, into being there for Arthur and John and the other gang members, into trying to guide them toward better choices and better futures. This selfless response to grief showed Hosea's character, his capacity to transform pain into compassion, to use his own losses as motivation to help others avoid similar losses. By 1899, when Red Dead Redemption 2 begins, Hosea is in his mid-50s and showing his age. He has lumbago, a chronic lower back pain that limits his mobility and causes him constant discomfort. He coughs frequently, suggesting respiratory problems that might be early signs of tuberculosis or another lung disease. The pain limited Hosea's mobility and made physical activity difficult, forcing him to rely more on his mind than on his body. Hosea is still sharp mentally, still capable of planning cons and robberies, still the gang's voice of reason and wisdom. But physically, he's declining, and he knows it. Hosea is aware that his time is limited, that he won't live to see old age, and this awareness colours his actions and his advice throughout the game. This awareness of mortality shaped Hosea's priorities and his advice in his final months. Hosea wasn't concerned about accumulating wealth or achieving some grand vision. He was concerned about making his remaining time meaningful and ensuring that the people he loved would be okay after he was gone. Hosea's focus was on relationships and on passing on wisdom, on making sure that Arthur and John had what they needed to survive and potentially to build better lives. But even during the gang's better years, Hosea could see warning signs and potential problems. Hosea tried to prepare the gang for these changes, tried to convince Dutch to be more cautious and to start thinking about eventual retirement or transition to legitimate life. Hosea suggested that they should be planning for retirement, for transitioning to legitimate life, or at least to less risky criminal activities. Hosea pointed out that the gang was getting older, that they couldn't keep running and fighting forever, that they needed to think about what came next. But Dutch was resistant to these suggestions, seeing them as defeatism or lack of faith in his vision. Dutch wanted to believe that one more big score would solve all their problems, that they could escape to some paradise where the modern world couldn't reach them. This fundamental disagreement about the gang's future created ongoing tension between Hosea and Dutch, but it was manageable as long as Dutch was willing to listen to Hosea's counsel on specific decisions, even if he didn't accept Hosea's broader vision. Hosea could live with Dutch's unrealistic dreams, as long as Dutch was still making pragmatic decisions in the present. But as Dutch became more resistant to counsel and more convinced of his own infallibility, the tension became destructive rather than creative. The events of Red Dead Redemption 2 begin with the gang in crisis, fleeing into the mountains after the disastrous Blackwater ferry robbery. The Blackwater job was ambitious and risky, targeting a ferry carrying a large amount of money in a town with significant law enforcement presence. Hosea probably opposed the plan, or at least had serious reservations about it, recognizing the risks and counselling caution. But Dutch, under pressure to provide for the growing gang and increasingly influenced by Micah Bell, pushed forward despite Hosea's concerns. The disaster at Blackwater vindicated Hosea's concerns and showed the consequences of ignoring his counsel. Multiple gang members were killed, the gang was forced to flee with law enforcement and Pinkertons in pursuit, and they lost the money they'd been counting on. Hosea is there with the gang in the mountains, helping them survive the harsh winter conditions despite his own physical limitations. During this early part of the game, Hosea's role as the voice of caution and wisdom is already evident. He questions Dutch's decisions, points out the risks they're taking, and tries to convince Dutch to be more careful and pragmatic. The introduction of Micah Bell to the gang, which happened sometime before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, was a development that Hosea viewed with suspicion and concern from the beginning. Hosea could read people, and he could see that Micah was cruel and self-serving, that Micah was manipulating Dutch and working to undermine Hosea's influence. The contrast between Hosea's approach and Micah's approach to crime illustrated the difference between intelligent outlawry and brutal thuggery. Micah's crimes were often unnecessarily violent, involving killing and cruelty that served no purpose beyond Micah's own enjoyment. Micah's approach drew attention and created enemies, making the gang's situation more dangerous and more precarious. Hosea tried to warn Dutch about Micah, tried to get Dutch to see that Micah was poison for the gang. Hosea's attempts to warn Dutch about Micah were persistent but ultimately unsuccessful. Hosea could see that Micah was manipulating Dutch, telling Dutch what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear, encouraging Dutch's worst impulses rather than checking them. But Dutch was drawn to Micah's boldness and his willingness to tell Dutch what he wanted to hear, and Dutch dismissed Hosea's concerns as jealousy or excessive caution. The conflict between Hosea and Micah was really a conflict over Dutch's soul and the gang's direction. Hosea represented caution, pragmatism, and compassion, the values that had guided the gang in its better days. Micah represented recklessness, cruelty, and self-interest, the worst impulses that Dutch was increasingly giving into. As long as Hosea was alive, there was some balance, some chance that Dutch might listen to reason. But Micah was working to undermine Hosea's influence, to turn Dutch against him, to ensure that when the final crisis came, Dutch would listen to Micah rather than to Hosea. The failure of these warnings was frustrating and frightening for Hosea, as he could see the gang heading toward disaster, but couldn't convince Dutch to change course. Hosea's influence over Dutch, which had been strong for over 20 years, was waning in the gang's final months. Dutch was listening more to Micah and less to Hosea, making decisions that Hosea knew were foolish and dangerous. This loss of influence was painful for Hosea personally, as it represented the deterioration of his relationship with Dutch, but it was also terrifying because Hosea could see the consequences coming and couldn't prevent them. As the gang descends from the mountains and establishes camp at Horseshoe Overlook, Hosea continues to serve as the gang's planner and strategist. He scouts out opportunities for robberies and cons, plans operations with Arthur, and tries to keep the gang functioning despite their desperate circumstances. The cons Hosea ran with Arthur show his methods and his skills in action. In one memorable con, Hosea poses as a wealthy businessman interested in investing in local enterprises, while Arthur plays various roles to support the deception. Hosea's performance is flawless, his accent and mannerisms perfectly matching his assumed identity. The con requires improvisation when unexpected complications arise, and Hosea handles these smoothly, adapting his approach to maintain the deception. These cons also show the relationship between Hosea and Arthur, the easy partnership and mutual trust that comes from years of working together. The gang's move to Rhodes and their involvement in the conflict between the Grey and Braithwaite families shows the growing tension between Hosea's pragmatism and Dutch's ambition. Dutch sees this as an opportunity to make easy money by playing both families against each other. Hosea is skeptical from the start, recognizing that the families are more cunning than Dutch gives them credit for, and that the situation is likely to spiral out of control. Hosea's concerns prove well-founded when the situation escalates into violence. Sean Maguire is killed, and Jack Marston is kidnapped by the Braithwaites. The kidnapping of Jack is a turning point for Hosea personally. Jack is John's son, but he's also part of the gang's family. a child that Hosea has helped raise and protect. Hosea participates in the gang's assault on Braithwaite Manor, helping to burn it down and kill most of the family in a furious display of vengeance. This violence is uncharacteristic for Hosea, who generally prefers to avoid bloodshed, but it shows the depth of his love for the gang's children and his willingness to do whatever's necessary to protect them. The gang's move to St. Denis, the big city that represents modernity and civilization, is particularly difficult for Hosea. St. Denis is everything the gang isn't: organized and civilized, with law enforcement that's well-funded and effective. Hosea knows that operating in the city is dangerous and likely to end badly. But Dutch is determined to pull off a big score in St. Denis, convinced that one more major robbery will give them enough money to escape to some tropical paradise. Hosea's recognition that he was losing the battle for Dutch's soul added urgency to his efforts to prepare Arthur for leadership and independence. Hosea knew that if Dutch continued on his current path, the gang would be destroyed and Arthur would need to be able to think for himself and make his own decisions. Hosea's final conversations with Arthur were attempts to give Arthur the tools and the confidence he'd need to survive without Hosea's guidance and potentially without Dutch's leadership. The conversations between Hosea and Arthur in the days before the bank robbery are poignant and revealing. These conversations show the depth of the father-son relationship between Hosea and Arthur, the genuine love and respect they have for each other. Hosea knows he's old and sick, knows that his time is limited, and he's trying to prepare Arthur for a future where Hosea won't be there to provide guidance and wisdom. Hosea tells Arthur that he's proud of him, that Arthur has become a good man despite the life they've led, that Arthur has the strength and the judgment to do what's right when the time comes. Hosea tells Arthur to think for himself, to not just follow Dutch blindly, to prioritize his own welfare and the welfare of people he cares about over loyalty to Dutch or the gang. Hosea tells Arthur that he's strong enough and smart enough to make his own decisions, that he doesn't need Dutch or anyone else to tell him what to do. Hosea also talks to Arthur about John and his family, about the importance of ensuring that John, Abigail and Jack survive and have a chance at a better life. Hosea recognizes that John is immature and often irresponsible, but Hosea also sees potential in John and believes that John could become a good man and a good father if he's given the chance and the right guidance. Hosea asks Arthur to look after John, to help him become the man he needs to be, to ensure that John's family survives even if the gang doesn't. These requests show Hosea's priorities in his final days. Hosea isn't concerned about his own legacy or his own comfort. He's concerned about the people he loves and their futures. These conversations are Hosea's way of saying goodbye, of passing on his wisdom and his hopes to the son he raised. Hosea goes along with Dutch's plan to rob the St. Denis Bank, despite his misgivings, because he's loyal to Dutch and because he doesn't see any better alternatives. Hosea helps plan the robbery, working with Dutch and Arthur to scout the bank and prepare for the operation. Hosea's participation in the bank robbery, despite his reservations, shows his loyalty to Dutch and his commitment to the gang. Hosea could have refused to participate, could have tried to convince others not to go through with it, could have left the gang before the robbery took place. But Hosea stayed and participated, partly because he was loyal to Dutch, and partly because he didn't see any better alternatives. Hosea hoped that if the robbery succeeded, it might give the gang the resources they needed to escape and survive. And if the robbery failed, Hosea wanted to be there to help his people survive the consequences. The St. Denis Bank robbery goes catastrophically wrong. exactly as Hosea feared it might. The Pinkertons are waiting for them, having been tipped off somehow about the robbery. The gang walks into a trap, and what should have been a carefully planned operation turns into a desperate shootout and escape attempt. The robbery's failure was total and catastrophic, showing how far the gang had fallen from their earlier, more successful operations. This wasn't a clever con or a well-executed heist. This was a desperate gamble that went wrong in the worst possible way. In the chaos, Hosea is captured by the Pinkertons on the street outside the bank. Hosea's capture during the chaos was almost inevitable given the circumstances. Hosea was old and sick, not as fast or as strong as he once was, not able to fight or run as effectively as younger gang members. When the shooting started and the gang scattered, Hosea was separated from the others and caught by the Pinkertons. Agent Milton, the lead Pinkerton agent hunting the gang, holds Hosea at gunpoint in front of a crowd of civilians and law enforcement. Milton, recognizing Hosea as one of the gang's leaders and seeing an opportunity to make an example, held Hosea at gunpoint in front of dozens of witnesses. Hosea's final moments are dignified and defiant. The confrontation between Hosea and Milton is brief but revealing. Even facing certain death, even held at gunpoint by the man who's been hunting the gang for months, Hosea doesn't beg or plead or show fear. He faces his death with courage and dignity, refusing to give Milton the satisfaction of seeing him break. Milton asks Hosea where Dutch is, trying to get information that will help him capture the gang's leader. Hosea refuses to answer, protecting Dutch and the gang even in his final moments, even though Dutch's decisions had led to this disaster. Milton tries to pressure Hosea, threatening him and trying to break his resolve, but Hosea remains defiant, refusing to give Milton what he wants. This defiance isn't bravado or foolish pride, it's genuine courage and loyalty, Hosea choosing to protect the people he loves even when it costs him his life. Hosea could have tried to bargain for his life, could have offered information in exchange for mercy. But Hosea chose to protect Dutch and the gang even in his final moments. This loyalty wasn't blind or stupid. Hosea knew exactly what he was doing and what it would cost him. But Hosea chose loyalty anyway, chose to die protecting the people he loved rather than betray them to save himself. Milton's decision to execute Hosea on the street is brutal and shocking, but it's also strategic. Milton wants to make an example, to show the gang and the public that the Pinkertons are powerful and that outlaws will face consequences for their crimes. Milton wants to demoralize the gang and to demonstrate that even their leaders aren't safe. The execution is public and violent, designed to be witnessed and remembered, to send a message about the cost of outlawry. Milton, frustrated by Hosea's defiance and perhaps wanting to make an example, shoots Hosea in the chest, executing him on the street in front of dozens of witnesses. Hosea's death is sudden and shocking, a brutal reminder that the gang situation is desperate and that the consequences of their lifestyle are catching up to them. Hosea's death is quick, a single gunshot to the chest that kills him almost instantly. There's no dramatic final speech, no extended death scene, just sudden violence and then Hosea is gone. This suddenness makes the death more shocking and more realistic, showing that death in the outlaw world is often quick and brutal rather than dramatic or meaningful. Hosea dies in the street surrounded by strangers, far from the people he loved and the places he knew. It's an undignified death for a man who deserved better. for Arthur, watching from a distance as Hosea is executed. The death is devastating. Arthur's reaction to watching Hosea die is visceral and overwhelming. Arthur is too far away to help, can only watch as the man who raised him is executed in the street. Hosea was Arthur's father in every way that mattered, the man who raised him and taught him and loved him. Hosea's death leaves Arthur without his primary source of guidance and wisdom, without the voice of reason that had always balanced Dutch's ambition and recklessness. Arthur's grief and rage in this moment are overwhelming, but he has to suppress them to focus on survival and escape. The gang is in immediate danger, surrounded by Pinkertons and law enforcement, and there's no time to process Hosea's death, or to retrieve his body. Arthur and the others have to run, have to fight their way out of St. Denis, have to survive the immediate crisis before they can grieve. The gang that escaped St. Denis after the bank robbery is fundamentally different from the gang that entered the city, having lost one of its founding members and its moral compass. The escape from St. Denis is chaotic and desperate, with the gang fighting through streets full of lawmen and civilians. The violence is excessive and indiscriminate, showing the gang at their most dangerous and most desperate. They kill anyone who gets in their way, law enforcement and civilians alike, in their frantic attempt to escape. This violence is a direct result of Dutch's poor planning and his refusal to listen to Hosea's warnings, showing the consequences of ignoring wise counsel. The gang's hijacking of a riverboat to escape the city seems like a success at first, but then a tropical storm sinks the ship and washes them up on the shores of Guarma. The Guarma sequence is surreal and disorienting, with the gang stranded in a foreign country in the midst of a revolution, completely disconnected from everything they know. During this time, the gang doesn't have the opportunity to properly grieve Hosea's death, or to process what happened in St. Denis. They're too focused on survival, on fighting in battles that have nothing to do with their own problems, on finding a way back to America. When the gang finally returns to America and reunites at Beaver Hollow, the full impact of Hosea's death becomes apparent. The gang that reunites is smaller, more fractured, and more desperate than the gang that went to St. Denis. Hosea is gone, Lenny is dead, and the gang's cohesion and morale are shattered. The camp at Beaver Hollow is grim and tense, with gang members arguing and suspecting each other, with Dutch becoming increasingly paranoid and erratic. The impact of Hosea's death on the gang cannot be overstated. Hosea was the balance to Dutch's ambition, the voice of caution that kept Dutch's plans from becoming too reckless, the pragmatist who thought through consequences and pointed out potential problems. Without Hosea, Dutch has no one to check his worst impulses, no one whose counsel he respects enough to actually listen to. The absence of Hosea's stabilizing influence is felt immediately and acutely. Without Hosea to mediate conflicts and counsel compromise, arguments between gang members escalate into serious rifts. Without Hosea to check Dutch's worst impulses, Dutch makes increasingly poor decisions based on paranoia and ego. Without Hosea to provide wisdom and perspective, the gang loses its moral centre and its sense of purpose beyond just survival. Micah Bell, who'd been working to undermine Hosea's influence and turn Dutch against him, now has Dutch's ear almost exclusively. Micah's influence over Dutch grows even stronger after Hosea's death, with Micah filling the void left by Hosea, but providing manipulation and encouragement of Dutch's worst impulses rather than wisdom and caution. Micah tells Dutch what he wants to hear, supports Dutch's paranoid theories about traitors, encourages Dutch's most reckless plans. Without Hosea there to provide a counterbalance, Micah's influence becomes almost total, and Dutch's descent into paranoia and cruelty accelerates. Dutch's behaviour after Hosea's death shows how much he relied on Hosea's counsel, even when he didn't always listen to it. Dutch becomes more paranoid, convinced that there's a traitor in the gang, suspecting people who've been loyal for years. Dutch becomes more reckless, planning operations that are desperate and poorly thought out, ignoring the warnings of Arthur and others who try to counsel caution. Dutch becomes more cruel, willing to sacrifice gang members and to make decisions that prioritise his own ego over the gang's welfare. The gang's trajectory after Hosea's death is one of accelerating decline and internal conflict, as Dutch makes increasingly poor decisions without Hosea there to counsel caution. Arthur's grief over Hosea's death is profound and lasting, affecting everything Arthur does in his final months. Arthur's journal entries about Hosea are full of love and pain, expressing how much Hosea meant to him and how lost Arthur feels without him. Arthur writes about the lessons Hosea taught him, about the example Hosea set, about the conversations they had in Hosea's final days. Arthur writes about his regrets, about things he wishes he'd said to Hosea, about his gratitude for everything Hosea did for him. For Arthur specifically, Hosea's death is a catalyst for his own transformation and his eventual break with Dutch. Arthur had been having doubts about Dutch's judgment for a while, but Hosea's presence had provided some reassurance that things might still work out, that Hosea would be able to guide Dutch back to better decisions. With Hosea gone, Arthur has to confront the reality that Dutch is leading the gang toward destruction, and that no one is left who can stop him. Arthur's growing disillusionment with Dutch after Hosea's death is partly about Dutch's actual behaviour, but it's also about the absence of Hosea's stabilising influence and wisdom. The other gang members' grief over Hosea's death shows how much he was loved and respected throughout the gang. Susan Grimshaw is devastated, having lost a friend and partner who'd been a constant presence in her life for years. Susan's grief is expressed in her increased drinking and her sharp words to gang members who aren't pulling their weight. The younger gang members like Lenny, who'd looked up to Hosea as a mentor, are shocked and saddened. Even gang members who were closer to Dutch than to Hosea recognise that they've lost something irreplaceable, that the gang without Hosea is fundamentally different and diminished. The gang's moral decline after Hosea's death is rapid and severe. Without Hosea to counsel compassion and caution, without Hosea to remind them of their principles, the gang becomes more violent and more reckless. The operations they undertake are desperate and poorly planned, often ending in unnecessary bloodshed. The gang's treatment of civilians becomes more callous, with less concern for innocent people who get caught in the crossfire. The internal conflicts within the gang escalate, with members turning on each other and suspecting betrayal. This moral decline shows how important Hosea's influence was in maintaining the gang's identity and its principles. Arthur's actions in his final months are heavily influenced by Hosea's teachings and example. When Arthur is diagnosed with tuberculosis and knows he's dying, he thinks about what Hosea would want him to do, about the lessons Hosea taught him, about what really matters. Arthur's eventual break with Dutch is influenced by Hosea's final conversations with him, by Hosea's encouragement to think for himself and to prioritise doing what's right over maintaining loyalty to someone who doesn't deserve it. Arthur's decision to help John Marston and his family escape, to prioritise their welfare over his own survival or his loyalty to Dutch, is exactly what Hosea would have wanted Arthur to do. Arthur's growing compassion in his final months, his efforts to help people he encounters and to do good where he can, reflect Hosea's example and his teachings about treating people with dignity and respect. When Arthur is dying and making his final stand, when he's fighting to give John time to escape with his family, Arthur is acting on principles that Hosea taught him. The conversations Arthur has with various people in his final months often echo things Hosea said or taught. When Arthur talks to the nun in St. Denis about faith and redemption, when he talks to Rains Fall about violence and peace, when he talks to John about responsibility and family, Arthur is drawing on wisdom that Hosea shared with him over the years. Arthur's own wisdom, earned through experience and reflection, is built on the foundation that Hosea provided, showing how a teacher's influence can shape a student's thinking long after the teacher is gone. Arthur's redemption is his own achievement, the result of his own choices and his own moral growth. But that redemption was made possible by Hosea's influence, by the foundation of wisdom and love that Hosea provided over more than 20 years. In this way, Hosea's legacy lives on through Arthur, through the good that Arthur does in his final months, and through the future that Arthur makes possible for John and his family. John's transformation from an immature, irresponsible young man to a devoted father and husband also shows Hosea's lasting influence. John's growth happens gradually over the course of Red Dead Redemption 2, and continues in the epilogue and in the first Red Dead Redemption game. John's decision to leave the outlaw life and build a legitimate life for his family, his efforts to be a good father to Jack and a good husband to Abigail, reflect the lessons Hosea tried to teach him about responsibility and love. John's ranch at Beecher's Hope, built with money that Arthur provided and with the future that Arthur's sacrifice made possible, represents the fulfillment of Hosea's hopes for his adopted sons. Hosea wanted Arthur and John to have chances at legitimate lives, to have families and homes and futures that didn't involve crime and violence. John's ranch, however temporary his peace there turns out to be, shows that Hosea's hopes weren't entirely futile, that at least one of his sons got to experience the kind of life Hosea wanted for them. When John eventually builds his ranch and tries to create a legitimate life for his family, when he names his ranch Beecher's Hope, after a conversation with Arthur about hoping for better, Hosea's influence is there. The chain of influence from Hosea through Arthur to John and his family shows how one person's love and wisdom can have lasting impact even when they don't live to see the results. Hosea died believing he'd failed to save Dutch or the gang, died without knowing whether Arthur and John would survive or whether his teachings would have any lasting effect. But Hosea's influence shaped Arthur's redemption, and Arthur's redemption enabled John's survival, and John's survival gave Jack Marston a chance at a life that didn't involve crime and violence. The ripples of Hosea's love and wisdom extended far beyond what Hosea could have known or imagined. The tragedy is that Hosea didn't live to see any of this, didn't get to see Arthur's redemption, or John's transformation, or the ranch at Beecher's Hope. Hosea died believing he'd failed, died without knowing that his life's work had meaning and impact, died before he could see the fruits of his decades of love and guidance. This is one of the saddest aspects of Hosea's story, that he died without knowing that his teachings would have lasting impact, that the love and wisdom he gave to Arthur and John would shape their choices and enable better futures. But from the player's perspective, from the perspective of someone who experiences the full story of Red Dead Redemption 2 and sees how events unfold after Hosea's death, Hosea's impact is clear and profound. Hosea's influence shapes the entire second half of the game, shapes Arthur's choices and his redemption, shapes Jon's survival and his eventual attempt at a legitimate life. Hosea's wisdom and his love echo through the story long after his death, showing that a good teacher's influence can endure and can shape events, even when the teacher isn't there to see the results. The question of what Hosea could have done differently, whether he could have saved himself or the gang or Dutch, is complex and doesn't have clear answers. Hosea did what he could with the tools and the understanding he had. He counselled caution and pragmatism. He tried to guide Dutch toward better decisions. He prepared Arthur for a future where Hosea wouldn't be there to provide guidance. But Hosea couldn't force Dutch to listen, couldn't prevent the gang's collapse through wisdom and advice alone, couldn't save people who wouldn't save themselves. Perhaps Hosea's greatest limitation was his inability or unwillingness to break with Dutch, to openly oppose Dutch's leadership, or to leave the gang when it became clear that Dutch was leading them toward destruction. Hosea advised Arthur to think for himself and to potentially break with Dutch, but Hosea himself never took that step. Hosea's loyalty to Dutch, built over 20 years of partnership and friendship, was too deep to break, even when breaking it would have been the rational choice. This loyalty was both Hosea's greatest virtue and his fatal flaw, keeping him committed to Dutch and the gang until the end, even when that commitment cost him his life. But this contradiction between Hosea's advice to Arthur and his own behaviour shows that Hosea understood what Arthur should do, but couldn't or wouldn't do it himself. Hosea stayed with the gang not because he believed in Dutch's vision of escaping to some tropical paradise, but because the gang was his family and he couldn't abandon them. Hosea knew that staying with the gang would probably lead to his death, but he chose to stay anyway, to be there for Arthur and Jon and the others for as long as he could. Hosea's final act of loyalty, refusing to tell Agent Milton where Dutch was even when facing certain death, showed his courage and his commitment to the people he loved. This final act of loyalty is both admirable and tragic. It's admirable because it shows Hosea's courage and his commitment to the people he loved, his willingness to sacrifice himself for them. But it's also tragic because Dutch didn't deserve this loyalty, because Hosea was protecting someone who'd stopped listening to his counsel and who was leading the gang toward destruction. Hosea died loyal to Dutch, but Dutch's response to Hosea's death was to become more reckless and more destructive, showing that Hosea's loyalty and his sacrifice didn't achieve what Hosea hoped they would. But perhaps Hosea's final act of loyalty wasn't really about Dutch. Perhaps it was about Hosea's own values and his own sense of who he was. Hosea had spent over 20 years being loyal to Dutch, had built his identity partly around that loyalty, had made commitments that he couldn't break even when breaking them would have been rational. Hosea's refusal to betray Dutch wasn't just about protecting Dutch. It was about Hosea being true to himself, about maintaining his integrity and his commitments even in the face of death. This consistency, this integrity, is what made Hosea admirable and what made his death tragic. Hosea was a good man in a bad situation, and he remained a good man until the end, even when being good cost him his life. Hosea's story raises important questions about the nature of success and failure, about how we measure a life's worth and impact. By conventional measures, Hosea's life was a failure. He was a criminal who spent decades breaking the law, who died violently in the street, who failed to save the gang he helped build, or the man he loved like a brother. Hosea didn't accumulate wealth or achieve fame or leave behind any conventional markers of success. He died as an outlaw, executed by law enforcement, his body probably buried in an unmarked grave or a pauper's cemetery. But by other measures that focus on relationships and influence rather than on wealth or status, Hosea's life was a success. He loved deeply and genuinely, raised 2 sons who weren't his by blood but were his by choice, influenced countless people through his wisdom and his example. He tried to be good in a bad situation, tried to guide others toward better choices, tried to make the world around him a little better, even when the world didn't reward that effort. These achievements don't show up in history books or on tombstones, but they matter. They have real impact on real people's lives. Hosea's legacy within the gang and within the Red Dead Redemption universe is one of wisdom, love, and tragic failure to prevent disaster, but also of lasting impact and enduring influence. Hosea was the wisest member of the Vandalina gang, the one who understood the outlaw life and its costs most clearly, the one who tried to guide others toward better choices. Hosea was loving and compassionate, a genuine father to Arthur and John, a friend and mentor to many gang members. But Hosea failed to save Dutch from his own worst impulses, failed to prevent the gang's collapse, failed to protect all the people he loved from the consequences of the outlaw life. But Hosea's failure doesn't negate the value of his efforts or the impact of his influence. Hosea's wisdom and his love shaped Arthur and John, gave them the foundation they needed to eventually make better choices. Hosea's example showed that even in a violent and unjust world, compassion and wisdom and love still matter, that trying to be good and to guide others toward better choices has value even when you can't prevent tragedy. In the end, Hosea Matthews was a con man who became a father, a thief who became a philosopher, an outlaw who tried to be a good man within the constraints of a bad life. He raised sons who weren't his by blood, but were his by choice and love. He tried to guide a gang toward better choices even when they wouldn't always listen. He loved deeply and wisely, cared for others more than he cared for himself, tried to make the world around him better, even when the world didn't reward that effort. Hosea died too soon, killed before his time, robbed of the chance to see how his influence would play out. But his legacy endured, his wisdom survived, his love continued to shape the people he'd touched. Hosea was the conscience of the Vandalind gang, the voice of reason in a world of violence, a father who tried to guide his sons toward better futures, even when he couldn't save himself. His story is one of love and wisdom and tragic failure, but also of lasting impact and enduring legacy. Hosea couldn't save everyone, couldn't prevent the disaster he saw coming, but he made things better than they would have been without him. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for, to love well, to guide wisely, and to leave the world a little better than we found it. Hosea Matthews did all of these things, and his story, tragic as it is also a testament to the enduring power of love and wisdom and compassion in a world that often seems to reward neither.